and welcome to episode 1 of Music Tech with Mr. Sharp. In today's lesson, we're going to learn about Soundtrap and how to create our own podcast. We'll begin by looking at how to open and access Soundtrap in Schoology, briefly discuss the function and purpose of a DAW, and then look at the loop library in Soundtrap. Let's get started. Okay, so here I am in my computer. I have an Apple computer. It'll work on Windows, Chromebook. It'll work on pretty much any platform. It'll even work on iPads, tablets, and phones. I don't really recommend it. It's probably best you work on some sort of computer. And you want to open Google Chrome as your web browser. If you don't have Google Chrome, I recommend you download that and have that. Other browsers will work. It just might be a little buggy. Okay, so you're going to go to Google Chrome and you're going to log into Schoology. In Schoology, you want to go up to your courses and open whatever music class you're in. On the left side here, there'll be all sorts of apps and buttons. On the very bottom, you want to find Soundtrap right here. So I'm going to click Soundtrap, and suddenly another window opens up, and this is the program. So you automatically have a Soundtrap account in Schoology. If you're an LAUSD student, you have Soundtrap in Schoology. You may not have that app if you're in a different class. Your teacher needs to add that app to your class in order for you to see that button, but you do have a Soundtrap account. Okay? We are here on the accounts page. You have projects, and every project you might be working on, you can put right here into various folders. You can be put into a group. So for example, orchestra might be, the whole class might be in a group called orchestra. Maybe you're working on another project and you want a group specifically for that team. So you can join different groups. You need to make sure you're in the same network or group in order to collaborate with classmates. We're going to jump right on in and enter the studio by clicking this right here. I click this, and suddenly the Soundtrap interface opens up, and it gives me an option of starting a new project, either a music project or a podcast. The difference between these is a little trivial, and it has to do with how the grid is displayed, and I'll go over that later. Since we're going to do a podcast, I'm going to click podcast, and here we are with a blank session. Right here is our editing palette, and so we can start by adding a brand new track, clicking here. There's also options to add a track by clicking one of these options, which we will get to later. So before we get started, let's talk a little bit about what is a DAW. DAW stands for Digital Audio Workstation, and it's a program musicians use to record music. Simple as that. It's how we digitally record music. And you can have all sorts of external equipment, microphones, preamps, all this hardware, but with Soundtrap, you don't need all that extra stuff. It's nice, but you don't need it. You just need your computer. You can record audio straight into the computer. If there was one thing that would be nice to have, at the very least, it would be a set of headphones, so when you record, that audio isn't bleeding through. All right, let's take briefly a look at a full Soundtrap session. All right, so we're going to briefly exit the studio, and we do that by clicking right here. And we go back to that first page, our accounts page. And I'm just going to open up a session I did last year in Zoom with the jazz band class. We were trying to record some tracks, and I introduced them to Soundtrap. I am going to, right here, click Studio on this project to open that particular session. And so here is a session we did. Each one of these lines represents one audio track. An audio track or a MIDI track. Don't worry about the difference between audio and MIDI just yet. I will explain that in the next lesson. In order to play, I could simply press the space bar here, or I can use these controllers down here, the transport. This is pretty straightforward. You see the red button, that's to record. This is stop, rewind, play, and fast forward. Okay, so I'm just gonna hit play. Again, I could just hit the space bar, and let's hear it.
Yeah, bring it, bring it. His name is Angus. He's a senior. He shreds at the trumpet, and he's my.
All right, so it's a silly track that was basically just a lesson we did right in a Zoom class where people were collaborating live in real time. Now there is a little delay, and we'll talk about how to collaborate later. So it's not like you can record at the same time. But when we get Angelo in here and we start doing the podcast, you'll see exactly how that works. Okay, so again, these are tracks. This is an audio track. This is a MIDI track. Different tracks. You can pull up loops by hitting this icon right here. This is the loop library, and I could add various loops. Some of these right here are loops that I pulled from this library. Others, as you heard the trumpet, that was actually recorded live, and you can tell right here on the left it says mic. These are what we call software instruments, and we'll talk more about that later. That's a software instrument. This right here was a loop. So this drums busy basics came from this loop library, and I just found it, did a search, cleared the search, found that. I bet I could, if I put that in there, busy, not busy, and busy basics, basics. And there it is, busy basics. So that's the loop I used. I can easily change the tempo of my project down here, and changing the key is a little tricky. We're going to talk more about that later when we get into an actual audio session. But let's get back to our podcast. Exit the studio. We come back to our accounts page, and we are going to open our podcast again. Studio. Just to give you an example of other DAW systems, the layout's pretty much the same. Here's an example of one session in Logic, the program made by Apple. This is the professional version of a digital audio workstation, DAW. And that intro track that you heard, that was actually recorded in Logic. I did it basically in one day. I do have some extra equipment. For example, a nice guitar amp, what's called an interface, where I connect my microphone to the computer. So there's some extra things I have to make the sounds really, really good. But again, you don't need a lot of equipment to make your audio recordings sound good. You just need to know what you're doing. So this is a session in Logic. GarageBand, by the way, is the same program. It's just the watered down program. So GarageBand looks very similar, just there's fewer options here. So let's just take a listen. All right, so I did some silly things, and with each track here, you can solo it. This is the silly thing that I was thinking of just now when I said that, and this is the sound of an explosion. But so my point here is that digital audio workstations, whether it's Logic, GarageBand, Soundtrap, they pretty much all have the same sort of layout. And so they're similar in that they all track audio in this linear sort of display on what's called a grid. And you see the grid is measured up here in units. And specifically, there's a 1, 2, 3, 4. And so if I zoom in here, you see this grid. And so, for example, that's measure 13, and the grid's further divided into 4s because I have set this to the meter of 4 beats and 4 quarter notes, 4/4, common time. All right. If I zoom in even further, it further divides the grid. So now we see those 4 beats. Here's measure 12. Beat 1 divided into 4s. 1, 2, 3, 4. Beat 2. 1, 2, 3, 4. Beat 3, and even says measure 12, beat 3, and then beat 4, and then the downbeat of the 13th measure, beat 1. Okay, so that is the grid. Now let's go back and look at Soundtrap and look at the difference between that podcast grid versus the music grid, which is the trivial difference that I was referring to earlier. So here we are, and we see this blank track that we haven't recorded anything on, and this is the grid. But notice when I hit podcast, it says :15, :20. That's because the grid is divided by time of a minute and minutes and seconds. And now I can change that. So I said it was a trivial difference. I have my settings icon right here, and I'm going to click that. And here is my grid. I can change the grid size. I can do one whole note, one divided by half notes, dotted, half note, quarter note, 16th note, 8th note, so on and so forth. And I can divide to the time signature to either 3/4 or 4/4. Most of the time you're just going to stick with 4/4. If you know what you're doing, you could divide the grid into 3/4, and you could change these other options. I would just leave it automatic and not worry about the other options. This, however, if you're a musician and looking at that time drives you crazy, you might want to change it to beats. So now I have my grid divided by measures. Measure 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth. Okay, so that's how you change your grid from time to beats. Okay, so here we go. Now we are in our session. We want to start our podcast with a introduction, little music playing, and then have the host make an announcement. Welcome to the show, yada, yada, yada. Music fades out, and then the show begins, and it's basically an interview between two people. So to get that music, we don't have to record anything new. We're just going to use loops from the loop library. And you're going to click this little icon here, and out pops this little loop browser on the side. And if there's anything written in here, you want to clear it. Right now it's blank, so I see all these different loops in here. I can audition the different loops by just hitting play. Okay, I want to start with maybe a little piano. And so I'm going to hit piano. And let me just see here. It's important to spend a lot of time sort of finding the loops that you want. This might take a little while because you're auditioning different things. And then you want to find two loops that work together, okay? All right, so I'm going to go with this loop right here, piano ADK electric grand. Let's just hear it real quick. Cool, very cool. So now I can just double click this, or I could click and drag and pull it in there. Let me just double click it. And suddenly it comes up in my session. Cool. So now the next thing I want is a little drum pattern. So let me find a drum pattern. Let me pause for a sec while I search. All right, cool. I think I found something. So again, I'm going to clear this browser. I'm going to hit that, and I have my drums. I'm going to hit drums, and it's an anthem. And anthem, beat 3, kick, and snare. There it is. Actually, kick, number 3. So I'm going to double click that. And let's just take a listen. All right, the syncopation is a little weird, so I'm going to pause it and just move it around a little bit. So what I did a couple things. First of all, I changed this from time to beats so that I could think in terms of measures. I also clicked this little guy. This is really important to have. This makes your audio snap to the grid, your loops snap to the grid. So if this is off, I can move this around. I can click and drag this and put it virtually anywhere in time. And that's not going to really help me if I'm trying to line these two things up. For some reason, this loop starts on a weird syncopated beat, and I just have to move it over by one quarter note. I can't really do that very well if I am not snapping to the grid. So I'm going to turn that on. That means snap to the grid. And so now that I'm snapped to the grid, I can grab this and notice it snaps. But it's snapping entire measures. That's not going to work for me. So what I need to do is I need to zoom in. I'm going to close this. And right here in the corner, you have some zoom tools. And so this is a plus and a minus, and I can zoom in on the session and get closer. And as I do that, notice that the grid now has subdivision. So now I see quarter notes. So the grid has been subdivided. So now I can move by one quarter note. So now let's hear that. All right, cool. I'm liking it. It's sounding pretty cool. Let's add a bass part. And again, let me pause the video just so I can make sure that I have a part that fits. Okay, I think I found something, and that is called bass. I'm just going to type it in here. Bright. Wah. It's nice as you're browsing through, if you find something you really like, maybe write it down somewhere else so that you can remember what that was. And it's number 1. So now when I have a bass part, it's going to be tricky to make sure that the bass works with the piano part. And there's different ways. Notice right here on the piano part, it says C minor. So you're going to need to be careful that you get loops that are basically in the right key and work harmonically. And I believe this one does. Notice this says bass, bright, wah, number 1. And it also, in parentheses, says it's in C minor. This grand piano part was in C minor. So harmonically, we're going to work here. Just let's take a listen. Cool, I'm liking that. Now I want to try to, I don't want the bass to start right off the bat, so I'm going to slide it over a little bit. And I'm not sure why the kick and snare don't start until the 3rd measure. That's a little weird. But I like not having the drums start right away. I kind of like just the piano intro. So let's hear that. Three, 4. All right, cool. Now let's zoom back out. And by the way, just a reminder, your zoom tools can be found right here in the corner. You can also do some quick keys if you know them. Quick keys can be found, you hit tutorials up here, and down here you have quick key shortcuts, and it'll show you a bunch of quick key shortcuts. I already know my quick key shortcuts. They're probably going to be different for different computers. For an Apple, it's basically Apple right and left arrows. So I can zoom in, I can zoom out, zoom in and zoom out. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to take off this loop thing, this loop bar right here. This basically makes me just loop these 8 measures over and over and over. I'm going to shut that off by hitting this icon right here. And I am going to just click and drag these out. and have them play, I don't know, let's say 12 bars. I'm going to pull this out about here, and I like the bass coming in about there, so that should work. Okay, so this is my introduction now. Let's take a listen. All right, I could keep going. I noticed the drum beat kept playing here. I think it's just sort of a glitch in the program or this particular loop. I don't know. All right, so let's get started and record our vocal introduction. You know, the introduction starts with music, and then the host says something, introduces themselves, the show, and their guest, what they're going to do in the podcast. So we're going to do that right here in this first initial track that opened up. And if I just click on it, up pops this window, and I can start recording right here, hitting this big button. I also have a record button right here on the bottom. And it's important, if you do have a USB mic, to make sure it's enabled, and you can find out whether or not it's being received by clicking right here and choosing these other options. You can, of course, if you don't have a USB mic, just choose to record straight into your internal mic. That'll work. It'll sound a little bit better with a USB. Most important, when you do this, wear some headphones so the sound isn't bleeding through into the recording. All right, so I do have an interface. I'm going to use this setting, and I am ready to go. And I'm going to make sure that my track is enabled right here by hitting the R button, and I'm going to hit record. Hello and welcome to the NHHS Music Podcast, Episode 1. My name's Mr. Sharp, and I'll be your host today as we talk to Angelo Frasina, one of 2 new drum majors here at North Hollywood High. Cool. And now in the next episode, we're going to work on how to edit this up, sort of do an audio fade, as well as how to collaborate with our guests. Right here's the collaboration tool, and you can already see that Angelo Frasina has logged in and he's ready. All right, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Hello and welcome to the NHHS Music Podcast, Episode 1. My name's Mr. Sharp, and I'll be your host today as we talk to Angelo Frasina.